I grabbed the doctor's sleeve in a hospital corridor, my voice shaking, and demanded to know if my husband was having an affair with someone on her staff. She looked at me for a long moment, calm in a way that unsettled me more than any answer could have, and said quietly, "You're asking the wrong question." My name is Priya Whitfield. I am 32 years old. I work as a physiotherapist in a small town called Larkspur, and for 7 months before that afternoon in the corridor, I had been building an entire private theory about my husband's secrets, using nothing but silence as my evidence. I was wrong about almost everything. I was also, in the strangest way, about to discover something far more complicated than the betrayal I had spent months quietly rehearsing in my mind. I want to tell you this story carefully, because I think it matters more than most stories I could tell you. And because I suspect some of you watching this have built theories of your own, in your own homes, using nothing but a partner's silence as your only clue. I did not plan to confront anyone that afternoon. I had gone to the hospital simply to find answers. Quietly, calmly, the way I had told myself I would approach this entire situation from the very beginning. But standing in that corridor, watching a doctor in pale blue scrubs walk past with a clipboard tucked under her arm, someone I recognized, somehow, from a hospital badge photo I had glimpsed once on Daniel's phone screen months earlier, something inside me simply broke open. I had spent the entire drive to the hospital that morning rehearsing a calm, measured approach, promising myself I would ask polite, careful questions, gather information gently rather than demanding it. All of that careful planning dissolved the moment I recognized her walking toward me, 7 months of accumulated fear and exhaustion rising up all at once, faster than any composure I had tried to prepare in advance. "Excuse me," I said, my voice louder than I intended, reaching out and catching her sleeve before she could pass. "Are you Dr. Voss? Amara Voss?" She stopped, turned, studied me with a careful, measured expression, the kind of expression I imagine doctors develop after years of encountering strangers in hospital corridors, who are clearly, visibly, unraveling. "I am," she said. "Can I help you with something?" "My husband," I said, the words tumbling out faster than I could control them. "Daniel Whitfield. He's been coming here for months. 7 months. He tells me he's at the gym, or running errands, or working late, and I know he's been coming here instead, and I need to know if he's seeing someone. If there's someone else. If you're the one he's—" I stopped, hearing my own voice crack, hearing how frantic and unhinged the words sounded once they were actually spoken aloud, rather than simply circling endlessly inside my own head during 7 months of sleepless nights. Dr. Voss studied me for a long moment, her expression softening slightly, though something else passed behind her eyes too, something careful, something weighing options I could not begin to guess at. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said gently, "I understand you're frightened, but I think you're asking the wrong question." I stared at her, my mind completely unable to process what she had just said. I had come here for a yes or no. I had spent 7 months preparing myself for exactly one kind of answer. And instead, this stranger in pale blue scrubs was telling me my entire question, the one I had rehearsed and dreaded for months, was somehow the wrong one entirely. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper now. What other question could there possibly be? She glanced around the corridor, at the nurses moving briskly past, at the families sitting in the small waiting area nearby, and said carefully, "This isn't the place for this conversation. Please come with me." If you are watching this, I want you to imagine, for a moment, preparing yourself for months for one particular kind of heartbreak, only to be told, by a complete stranger, that you have been asking entirely the wrong question the whole time. I did not know it yet, following Dr. Voss down that corridor, my legs unsteady beneath me, but the truth waiting for me was going to be far stranger and far more complicated than anything my exhausted imagination had constructed over those 7 long months. I remember the corridor itself in strange, vivid fragments as I walked, the particular smell of antiseptic mixed faintly with someone's coffee, a child's laughter drifting from somewhere down a side hallway, the soft squeak of Dr. Voss's shoes against the polished floor. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I should have worn different shoes, that my feet already ached. Small, meaningless thoughts my mind kept reaching for, the way it always seemed to reach for small, ordinary details whenever something enormous was unfolding just beyond my ability to properly absorb it. To understand how I ended up grabbing a stranger's sleeve in a hospital corridor, I need to take you back 7 months, to the beginning of what I now think of as the quiet unraveling, though at the time, it felt like nothing more than a series of small, disconnected oddities I kept trying and failing to explain away. It started small, the way these things always seem to. Daniel began staying out later than usual, always with a reasonable explanation attached. The gym, a work project, an errand that had somehow taken 3 hours longer than it should have. I remember not thinking much of it at first, the way you don't think much of a single missing puzzle piece until you've noticed several missing in a row. I remember finding a parking receipt in his coat pocket one evening, doing laundry the way you sometimes discover small, accidental clues while performing entirely ordinary domestic tasks. It was from the hospital parking garage, dated 2 weeks earlier, time-stamped for nearly 3 hours in the middle of a weekday afternoon, when Daniel had told me he was meeting a client. I remember staring at that small piece of paper for a long time, turning it over in my hands, trying to construct some reasonable explanation before finally, quietly, tucking it into a drawer instead of asking him directly, telling myself I would bring it up eventually, once I understood more. I did not bring it up. Not that week, not the following week. Instead, I began watching him more closely, noticing small things I might otherwise have overlooked entirely. A phone he kept angled away from me at dinner, a habit of stepping into another room to take certain calls, a tiredness around his eyes that seemed to deepen steadily over those months, the particular exhaustion of someone carrying something heavy they cannot set down, even briefly, even at home. I remember, too, small changes in his appetite during that period, evenings when he barely touched his dinner, claiming he had eaten a large lunch, though I noticed quietly that he seemed to be losing a little weight, his face slightly more drawn than usual. I remember wondering, briefly, whether he might be unwell himself, before dismissing the thought in favor of the far more familiar, more frightening theory that had already begun taking root in my mind, the theory that felt, somehow, more explicable than illness, more consistent with the small evasions I had been quietly cataloging. I remember, too, how our evenings together changed during those months, small shifts I did not fully register until much later. We used to cook dinner together most nights, a small, easy ritual we had built over 6 years of marriage, chopping vegetables side by side, talking easily about our days. During those 7 months, Daniel began arriving home later and later, often after I had already eaten, offering apologies that grew increasingly brief, increasingly rehearsed, until eventually I simply stopped waiting for him most evenings, cooking for one, eating alone at our kitchen table while his portion sat covered on the stove, growing cold. I remember, too, a particular Sunday morning, nearly 5 months into this quiet unraveling, when Daniel's phone rang early, before either of us had fully woken, and he stepped out of our bedroom quickly to answer it, his voice low and urgent through the closed door. When he returned, he told me it was a work colleague dealing with an emergency, though I remember noticing, even then, how pale he looked afterward, how he barely touched his coffee that morning, staring instead at something distant and troubled I could not identify. I want to ask you something, because I think many of you watching this have experienced some version of it yourselves. Have you ever built an entire private theory about someone you love, using nothing but silence as your evidence, filling in the gaps with whatever explanation frightened you most? I did exactly that, for 7 long months, constructing an entire narrative in my mind, revising it constantly, always circling back toward the same devastating conclusion, that Daniel was seeing someone else, that our marriage was quietly dissolving in increments too small for me to properly name or confront. I remember asking him directly once, nearly 4 months into this quiet unraveling, whether everything was all right between us, whether he was unhappy, whether there was something he needed to tell me. I remember the particular way his face changed when I asked, a flicker of something that looked, at the time, exactly like guilt, though I understand now it was something closer to fear. Everything's fine, he said, too quickly, too smoothly, the kind of answer that convinces no one, least of all the person asking. I've just had a lot going on at work. I'm sorry I've been distant. I let it go, that time, the way I let so many things go during those months, telling myself I was being paranoid, that healthy marriages required trust, that constructing elaborate theories about my own husband's secrecy was a symptom of my own insecurity rather than evidence of anything real. I understand now how thoroughly I had convinced myself that doubting him was somehow the greater sin, worse than whatever he might actually be hiding. There were other small signs too, scattered throughout those months, that I did not fully understand until much later. Daniel began keeping a small notebook in his bedside drawer, one he had never kept before, writing in it occasionally late at night when he thought I was asleep. I found it once, briefly, flipping through pages filled with what looked like medical terminology, dates, numbers I did not understand, before hearing him approaching and quickly, guiltily, sliding it back into the drawer exactly where I had found it, telling myself I would ask him about it eventually, the way I told myself so many things during those 7 careful, quietly agonizing months. My mother, visiting one weekend during that period, asked me gently over tea whether Daniel seemed all right to me lately, whether something felt different in the house. I remember deflecting the question, telling her everything was simply busy, work stress, nothing worth worrying over, even as some quieter part of me registered, with a small, uncomfortable jolt, that my own mother had noticed the same shift I had been trying so hard to explain away to myself. I have thought about that conversation often since, wondering how differently things might have unfolded had I simply told her the truth of my growing unease that afternoon, rather than protecting a version of my marriage that, even then, I sensed was quietly slipping away from the version I understood. I also remember, near the end of those 7 months, a strange, small moment that seemed insignificant at the time, but returns to me often now. Daniel came home one evening carrying a small stuffed rabbit, explaining briefly that he'd seen it in a shop window and thought it looked like something a kid would love, before quickly, almost too quickly, tucking it into his bag rather than leaving it out on our kitchen counter the way he usually left small purchases. I remember feeling a flicker of confusion at the time, wondering why a grown man would impulsively buy a child's toy with no apparent occasion attached to it, before letting the thought slip away, filed alongside dozens of other small confusions I had simply stopped examining too closely. By the 7th month, I could no longer bear simply waiting, constructing theories, tucking small pieces of evidence into drawers instead of confronting them directly. One evening, when Daniel told me he was heading to the gym, I made a decision I had never made before in 6 years of marriage. I followed him. I remember sitting in my car outside our house for a long moment before actually pulling out, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my heart already pounding as though I somehow already sensed the significance of what I was about to do. I had never followed anyone in my life. It felt, in that moment, like crossing some invisible threshold I could never fully step back across, regardless of what I discovered on the other side of it. I remember my hands trembling on the steering wheel, staying carefully several cars back, watching him drive not toward the gym at all, but directly toward the hospital. The same hospital where I had once found that parking receipt tucked accidentally into his coat pocket. I watched him park, walk inside, not through the emergency entrance, but through a specific outpatient wing I did not recognize, a section of the hospital I had never had reason to visit myself. I sat in my car outside for nearly 20 minutes afterward, my mind racing through every possible explanation, each one worse than the last. I did not follow him inside that evening. I could not bring myself to do it, uncertain what I might find, uncertain whether I truly wanted to know the answer standing directly in front of me rather than continuing to construct my own, careful, distant theories from a comfortable remove. I drove home that night in a strange, hollow silence, rehearsing conversations in my head that I never ended up having, arriving before Daniel, sitting alone in our darkened kitchen until I heard his key finally turn in the lock nearly an hour later. He greeted me cheerfully, mentioned a good workout, asked what I wanted for dinner, and I remember studying his face carefully in that moment, searching for some visible sign of the lie I now knew, with absolute certainty, he had just told me, finding nothing, only the same familiar, exhausted warmth I had loved for 6 years. I did not sleep at all that night, lying beside him in the darkness, replaying the image of him walking through those hospital doors, over and over, trying to construct some explanation that did not lead toward heartbreak, failing, each time, to find one that felt remotely convincing. Instead of confronting him, I returned the following day, alone, without Daniel's knowledge, dressed carefully, rehearsing what I would say the entire drive over. I approached the front desk of that same outpatient wing, my voice steadier than I expected, and explained that I was concerned family, that my husband had been coming here regularly, that I needed to speak with whichever doctor had been seeing him. I want to ask you something honestly, because I think it matters. Is it wrong to go looking for a truth someone isn't ready to give you themselves, especially when that silence has already stretched across 7 long, difficult months? I did not know the answer to that question standing at that front desk, and I am still, in some ways, uncertain of it now. I only knew that I could no longer continue living inside 7 months of careful, exhausting uncertainty. The receptionist made a brief phone call, spoke quietly to someone I could not hear, and told me, after a few minutes, that Dr. Voss would be available shortly, that I should take a seat in the corridor and wait. I sat in that plastic chair for nearly 15 minutes, watching people move past, families clutching folders of paperwork, nurses pushing quiet, wheeled carts, an entire small ecosystem of hospital life I had never had reason to notice before, my heart pounding steadily louder with every passing minute. I remember watching a young father across the waiting area, holding a small child on his lap, gently pointing out something in a picture book, and feeling a sudden, unexpected pang of something I could not quite name, some quiet, aching awareness that families carry entire private worlds of difficulty inside them, invisible to anyone passing by. Exactly the way mine apparently did too. Dr. Voss led me into a small, quiet consultation room, gesturing for me to sit, closing the door gently behind us. She sat across from me, her expression careful, measured, the expression of someone weighing exactly how much she was permitted to say and how much she desperately wanted to say, despite whatever boundaries constrained her. "I need you to understand something first," she said carefully. "I am bound by patient confidentiality. There are limits to what I can share with you, regardless of how frightened or confused you might currently feel." "Please," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "I just need to know if he's seeing someone, if there's another woman. I've spent 7 months trying to figure out what's happening, and I can't keep living like this, not knowing anything at all." Dr. Voss was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with an expression I could not quite read, something between sympathy and careful calculation. And then she said the words that would end up defining this entire story, the sentence I have thought about, turned over in my mind, countless times since that afternoon. "You're asking the wrong question." I stared at her, my mind completely unable to process what she had just said. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper now. What other question could there possibly be? She was quiet for a moment longer, seeming to weigh something carefully in her mind, before finally reaching for a folder resting on the small table beside her. "There's something I need to explain to you," she said, "and I want you to know that what I'm about to share is only possible because of a specific arrangement your husband made, precisely anticipating a moment like this one." I remember sitting very still in that moment, watching her hands move carefully over the folder, aware suddenly of the particular hush of that small room, the soft hum of the air conditioning overhead, the muffled sounds of the corridor beyond the closed door. Everything around me seemed to slow down, the way I imagine it does for anyone about to receive news large enough to reshape the shape of their entire understanding. Before she answered, "I want to take a small moment to speak with you directly because I know exactly how badly you are waiting to hear what she said next, the same way I sat there, frozen, waiting, my entire body braced for an answer I could not yet imagine. If this story has kept you here, wondering, holding your breath the way I was holding mine in that small consultation room, I would be so grateful if you considered subscribing to this channel. Stories like this one, honest and complicated and deeply human, deserve to be told carefully, and having you here with me means more than you know. Thank you for staying. Now let me tell you exactly what Dr. Voss said next. "Your husband," she said slowly, choosing each word with visible care, "has given me written consent in advance in case exactly this situation ever arose, to share certain information with you if you came here asking these particular questions. He anticipated, I think, that you might eventually reach this point, though I don't believe he expected it to take quite this long, or to unfold quite this way." I felt my chest tighten, uncertain whether relief or dread was the more appropriate response to what she was clearly about to tell me. "Just tell me," I said quietly. "Whatever it is. I can't sit here guessing any longer." Dr. Voss nodded, her expression softening slightly, the careful, professional distance she had maintained until that point giving way, briefly, to something more openly compassionate. "Daniel has spent the past 7 months undergoing testing and treatment," she continued, "as a potential bone marrow donor for a 9-year-old girl currently receiving treatment for leukemia in our pediatric oncology unit." She paused, watching my face carefully before continuing. "The child's name is Mira. She is your husband's biological daughter, from a relationship that existed before he met you." I sat perfectly still, the words landing somewhere far beyond my ability to immediately process them. A daughter. a child I had never known existed, somewhere in this very hospital, fighting an illness I had no idea Daniel was even aware of, let alone quietly, desperately trying to help treat for 7 entire months, all while I sat at home constructing theories about affairs and betrayals that, I now understood, were not the truth at all, simply a far smaller, far more familiar shape of fear than the one actually waiting for me. A daughter, I repeated slowly, testing the word aloud, as though saying it might help it settle into something I could actually understand. He has a daughter, and he never told me. Not once. In 6 years. Dr. Voss did not answer that directly, understanding, I think, that it was not truly a question meant for her to answer, but rather something I needed to say aloud, simply to begin absorbing its enormous weight. Dr. Voss arranged for Daniel to meet me shortly afterward in a small private room down the hall, explaining gently that he had been informed the moment I arrived asking these particular questions, that he had likely known, walking toward that room, exactly what conversation was waiting for him on the other side of the door. He looked older than I remembered him looking that morning, when he had kissed me goodbye and told me he was heading to work as usual. His eyes were red, exhausted, carrying the particular weight of someone who has been holding an enormous secret for far too long, finally, unexpectedly, forced to set it down. Priya, he said, his voice unsteady. I'm so sorry. I should have told you so much sooner. I've wanted to, every single day for 7 months, and I couldn't find the courage. I sat across from him, my own emotions tangled into something I could not yet fully name, relief and anger and grief and confusion, all colliding together at once. Tell me now, I said quietly. All of it. He explained haltingly, painfully, a relationship from his early 20s, before we had ever met, with a woman named Sable, a relationship that had ended before either of them knew she was pregnant. He told me he had known about Mira almost since her birth, though Sable had made it clear, early on, that she preferred to raise her independently, that she did not want Daniel deeply involved in her daily life, an arrangement he had, reluctantly, respected for years, sending financial support quietly, seeing Mira occasionally, but never in any way that had crossed into the life he later built with me. I should have told you when we got married, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I should have told you the moment we met, honestly. But the longer I waited, the harder it became to imagine how to even begin that conversation, how to explain why I hadn't mentioned it sooner. And then, 7 months ago, Sable called me, told me Mira had been diagnosed, that she needed a bone marrow transplant, that the doctors were searching for a match, and suddenly none of my old excuses mattered anymore. I just needed to be tested, to see if I could help her, and I was so afraid of everything unraveling at once, the secret about Mira alongside her diagnosis, that I simply didn't tell you anything. I told myself I would explain everything once I knew whether I was even a match, whether any of it would matter at all. Did your parents know? I asked. Your sister? Anyone at all? This entire time? My sister knew, he admitted quietly. She's known since Mira was born. I made her promise never to tell you, and I know now what an unfair position that put her in, carrying that secret alongside me all these years, watching us build a life together while knowing something so significant remained hidden from you. I felt a fresh wave of something complicated rise in my chest, hearing that, understanding that this secret had not existed in complete isolation, that other people in our lives had quietly carried pieces of it too, that family gatherings and holidays over the years had likely contained small, careful silences I had never once suspected. I need you to understand, Daniel continued, his voice unsteady, that none of this ever meant I loved you any less, or that our marriage was somehow less real to me. I made a terrible choice years ago, staying silent, and then I kept making that same choice, day after day, because each day made the truth feel harder to finally speak aloud. When Sable called 7 months ago, when I learned Mira was sick, I told myself I would tell you everything the moment I understood what was actually happening, whether I was a match, what the treatment would even involve. I kept waiting for a moment that felt right, and there was never a moment that felt right, only moments that felt slightly less impossible than the day before. I want to ask you something honestly, because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. If someone hid something out of fear rather than malice, does that change how you judge the silence itself? I sat with that question for a long time afterward, turning it over carefully, understanding that fear and cowardice sometimes wear remarkably similar disguises, even when their underlying motivations feel, to the person carrying them, entirely different. Are you a match? I asked quietly, setting aside for the moment the enormity of everything else he had just told me. Yes, he said, his voice cracking. I found out 3 weeks ago. The transplant is scheduled for next week. Why couldn't you have told me even just about the transplant? I asked, even without explaining everything else first? Why did I have to learn all of it at once, in the worst possible way? Because telling you about the transplant meant telling you about Mira, he said quietly. And telling you about Mira meant admitting I'd hidden an entire piece of my life from you for 6 years. I couldn't find a way to separate those two conversations. I tried, more times than you know, and every single time, I lost my nerve before I could finish a single sentence. I did not decide immediately whether I wanted to meet her. I spent several days afterward in a strange, unsteady state, cycling between anger at Daniel's years of silence and a growing, unexpected awareness of a 9-year-old girl somewhere in that hospital, fighting for her life, entirely unaware of the complicated adult reckoning her existence had just triggered in a marriage she knew nothing about. Eventually, I decided I needed to see her, not out of any obligation to Daniel, but because I could not fully understand my own feelings about any of this without first understanding, honestly, who Mira actually was, beyond the abstract, devastating revelation she had represented in that small consultation room. Daniel arranged the meeting carefully, speaking first with Sable, who agreed cautiously that I could visit, though I sensed, meeting her briefly beforehand, a complicated wariness in her expression too. An entire history I would likely never fully understand, layered beneath this sudden, urgent, present crisis. She was polite, careful, guarded in a way that felt entirely reasonable given everything she, too, was currently navigating. A daughter's illness colliding unexpectedly with a stranger's sudden appearance in a story she had spent years managing quietly, mostly alone. Sable and I spoke briefly in the hallway before I entered Mira's room, an awkward, careful conversation neither of us had rehearsed. I want you to know, she said quietly, I never asked Daniel to keep this from you. That was entirely his choice, not something I demanded of him. I always assumed over the years that you simply knew and had chosen not to be involved. Finding out otherwise, that you'd known nothing at all, has been difficult for me too, in its own way. I appreciated her honesty in that moment, understanding that she too had built her own version of events around Daniel's careful omissions, an entire misunderstanding layered atop his original secret. Mira was smaller than I expected, pale from months of treatment, her head wrapped in a soft patterned scarf, sitting up in her hospital bed surrounded by a small collection of well-worn stuffed animals. She looked at me with open, unguarded curiosity, the particular directness children sometimes carry, entirely unaware of the complicated adult tensions surrounding her. Are you Daniel's wife? She asked, before I had even fully stepped into the room. I am, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. My name is Priya. He talks about you sometimes, she said. He says you fix people's bodies for a job. That sounds cool. I felt something unexpected shift in my chest, hearing that small, simple detail, understanding that Daniel had, in whatever complicated, secretive way he had managed his double life, still spoken of me to this child, still held some quiet thread connecting the two separate halves of his existence, even while keeping them so carefully apart from each other. We talked for nearly an hour that first visit, about nothing in particular at first. Her favorite books, a television show she loved, the specific stuffed rabbit she refused to let leave her side even during treatment, its worn ear held together with a small strip of medical tape she proudly explained she had applied herself. Gradually, the conversation grew slightly deeper, and she asked me, with the same startling directness, whether I was upset that her dad had a daughter he never told me about. I considered the question carefully before answering, aware of how much weight a child could carry from an adult's careless response. I was surprised, I said honestly, and I'm still figuring some things out. But none of that is your fault, Mira. I'm glad I get to know you now, however this all happened. She seemed to accept that answer easily, the way children often accept honest, simple truths more readily than adults sometimes expect, before quickly changing the subject back to her stuffed rabbit's ongoing adventures, a small, welcome return to lighter ground. I visited again 2 days later, bringing a small gift, a soft, patterned blanket I thought she might like for the long hospital days ahead, and I remember the genuine delight on her face, unpracticed and immediate, the kind of reaction that made the entire complicated situation feel, briefly, remarkably simple. She showed me a drawing she had made that morning, a small family of stick figures standing beneath a bright yellow sun, and pointed to one figure in particular. That's you, she said matter-of-factly, as though it were the most natural inclusion in the world. I did not correct her. I found sitting there that I did not want to. I want to ask you something honestly because I think it matters. Can you be angry at someone, genuinely, deeply angry, and still show up, fully and honestly, for the child caught entirely innocently in the middle of their mistake? I sat with Mira for nearly an hour that afternoon, and I understood, sitting there, that whatever anger I still carried toward Daniel, it had absolutely nothing to do with this particular, remarkable little girl who deserved every bit of honest presence I could offer her, regardless of the complicated circumstances surrounding her existence. The transplant took place the following week, a long, tense day that Daniel and I spent together in the hospital waiting area, alongside Sable, an uneasy but civil alliance formed entirely around Mira's survival, rather than any comfort with each other's presence. I remember holding Daniel's hand during the longest stretches of waiting, not entirely out of forgiveness, but out of a shared, desperate hope that transcended, at least temporarily, everything else still unresolved between us. I remember, too, small moments of unexpected connection during that long day, Sable offering me half of a sandwich she had brought, neither of us particularly hungry but grateful for something to occupy our hands during the endless waiting. We did not talk much about Daniel, or about the years of silence that had led all three of us to that particular waiting room. Instead, we talked about Mira, about her stubborn love of a particular cartoon, about the drawing she had shown me 2 days earlier. Small, safe conversational ground that allowed us to sit together without needing to address the far more complicated territory surrounding us. The transplant, thankfully, was successful, though Dr. Voss was careful to explain that the coming months would require close monitoring, that recovery from a procedure like this is rarely a simple, linear path towards certainty. Mira's prognosis, she explained gently, was cautiously hopeful, not guaranteed, the way these situations so rarely offer anyone a fully guaranteed outcome, only the best available chance. Carefully monitored, carefully hoped for. Daniel and I began attending counseling together shortly after the transplant, working through what turned out to be a far deeper betrayal than the fear I had originally carried into that hospital corridor. It was never really about another woman, I came to understand slowly, through difficult, honest conversations with our counselor. It was about 6 years of marriage built without full transparency, 6 years during which an entire piece of Daniel's life, and now, urgently, a piece of both our futures, had remained carefully hidden from me. Our counselor asked us both, during one particularly difficult early session, what honesty would have actually looked like, years earlier, if Daniel had found the courage to share the truth about Mira before we ever married. I remember sitting with that question for a long time, uncertain how I would have responded, all those years ago, uncertain whether our entire relationship might have unfolded differently, or whether, given enough time and understanding, I might have simply accepted it as one complicated piece of the man I loved. I will never fully know the answer to that question, and I have slowly come to accept that some uncertainties, once created by years of silence, simply cannot be fully resolved afterward, only carried forward carefully, honestly, from this point onward. During one particularly difficult session, several weeks into our counselor asked me directly what I needed from Daniel moving forward. Beyond simple apology, beyond the initial shock of discovery. I remember struggling to answer at first, before finally admitting that what I needed most was not a guarantee that nothing like this would ever happen again, an impossible promise for anyone to make honestly, but a demonstrated pattern of choosing honesty even when it felt frightening, even when silence might have seemed easier in the moment. Daniel has, in the months since, made a visible, consistent effort toward exactly that, small moments of unprompted transparency that, slowly, painstakingly, are beginning to rebuild something between us that feels sturdier than the comfortable, incomplete version of trust we had before. I want to ask you something honestly, because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. What is the right question to ask when the truth you eventually find isn't the one you expected at all? I have thought about that question often, in the months since that afternoon in the hospital corridor, understanding slowly that I had spent 7 months asking who, when the far more important questions, all along, were why, and eventually, what now? Our marriage did not repair itself instantly, the way perhaps a simpler version of this story might suggest. Daniel and I are still, carefully, deliberately, rebuilding trust, one honest conversation at a time, working through years of accumulated silence that cannot simply be undone by a single dramatic hospital revelation, however significant that revelation turned out to be. But we are moving forward now with something we did not fully have before, a commitment to full honesty, however difficult, however uncomfortable, rather than the careful, protective secrecy Daniel had once believed, mistakenly, would somehow spare me pain. Mira is doing well now, months after her transplant, her most recent scans showing encouraging progress, though Dr. Voss continues to remind us, gently, that ongoing monitoring remains essential for the foreseeable future. I visit her occasionally now, alongside Daniel, building slowly, carefully, an honest relationship with a child who is, undeniably, part of our family now, whether I originally asked for that particular complication or not. She recently asked me to help her pick out new bed sheets for her room, now that her hair is slowly beginning to grow back, and I remember feeling a quiet, unexpected warmth, standing beside her in a small shop, holding up two different patterns for her consideration, an entirely ordinary moment that would have seemed impossible to imagine only months earlier. My relationship with Sable has also, slowly, cautiously, found a kind of workable rhythm. Not friendship exactly, but a mutual, respectful understanding built entirely around Mira's well-being. We coordinate occasionally now, birthdays and school events, small logistical conversations that would have seemed unthinkable to either of us during that first tense afternoon in the hospital waiting room. She told me recently that she appreciates how naturally I've folded myself into Mira's life, without forcing anything, without expecting gratitude or acknowledgement for showing up consistently. I told her honestly that Mira deserved that consistency regardless of how complicated the adults around her had made things. If this story has moved you the way living through it moved me, thank you sincerely for staying with me until the end. And if you have not already, please consider subscribing to this channel so we can continue sharing honest, human stories like this one together. I still think often about that moment in the hospital corridor, grabbing Dr. Voss's sleeve, demanding an answer to a question that turned out to be entirely the wrong one. I understand now what she meant, standing there in her pale blue scrubs, studying my frightened, exhausted face with such careful, measured patience. The question I had spent 7 months preparing myself to ask, "Is there someone else?" was never going to lead me toward the truth I actually needed. The right question, all along, buried beneath months of silence and fear and careful, painful secrecy, was simply this: what is my husband so afraid to tell me? And why has he decided, all on his own, that I could not handle knowing it? It has been nearly a year now since that afternoon in the hospital corridor, and I find myself, sometimes, thinking about how different an ordinary Tuesday looks now compared to the version I lived inside during those 7 anxious, uncertain months. Daniel and I still attend counseling regularly, though our sessions now focus less on crisis management and more on the slower, steadier work of building genuine, lasting transparency into an ordinary married life. I have learned this past year that trust rebuilt after significant betrayal does not simply return to its original shape. It becomes something different, something perhaps sturdier in certain ways, built consciously rather than assumed passively, checked gently rather than extended blindly. I no longer assume Daniel's silences mean nothing concerning, but I also no longer spiral immediately into worst-case theories the way I once did during those 7 difficult months. We have found, together, a middle ground built on actual communication rather than either blind faith or constant suspicion. Daniel and I talk now, most evenings, in a way we somehow never quite managed before, even in the earlier, seemingly happier years of our marriage. It occurs to me sometimes that the crisis, devastating as it was, forced a kind of honesty between us that might never have developed otherwise, that comfortable marriages can sometimes coast for years on assumed understanding rather than actual, spoken transparency. I would never wish for the circumstances that brought us here, but I have come to appreciate, cautiously, what we built afterward, out of necessity, that we had never quite built before. Mira visited us at our home for the first time last month, a small, careful milestone that felt enormous in its quiet significance. She admired my garden, asked thoughtful questions about the physiotherapy patients I work with, and left, at the end of the visit, with a promise that she could return again soon. Watching her walk toward Sable's car afterward, waving cheerfully over her shoulder, I felt something I could not have imagined feeling during that devastating afternoon in the hospital corridor, a genuine, uncomplicated gladness that she is, now, fully and honestly, part of the family I continue building with Daniel. I think often about how differently this entire story might have unfolded had I never followed Daniel that evening, had I simply continued waiting, quietly, for an explanation that might never have arrived on its own. I do not know whether I would make that same choice again, given the chance, though I suspect I would, understanding now, as I did not fully understand then, that some silences, left unexamined long enough, only grow heavier, never lighter, the longer they are allowed to remain unspoken. Some journeys begin with fear disguised as certainty, a theory constructed carefully in the absence of truth. Mine began that way too, and ended somewhere I never expected, sitting beside a 9-year-old girl's hospital bed, listening to her describe her favorite stuffed rabbit with the same open, unguarded honesty I now hope to carry forward into every difficult conversation, still waiting for Daniel and me. And if there is one thing I hope you carry with you after this story, it is this. Sometimes the truth we are most afraid to ask for is not the one that breaks us, but the one that, eventually, quietly, finally, sets an entire family free to become honest with each other again.